they would have used them, because many of them were under the command of local commanders. Fidel Castro was arguing with Khrushchev to use them. He was ready to light the fuse. He was ready to go up. Here's a little story, then I'll end with this. I think this must have been after the fall of the Soviet Union, where there was a conference sponsored by the Carnegie Endowment, where I work, in Moscow, and it brought together veterans of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one of them was Defense Secretary Robert McNamara. And he was on a panel talking. And in the audience, it was like this. A guy stood up, and he was the captain of one of the submarines in the Cuban Navy that was escorting the ships with the new missiles to Cuba. You remember, the whole thing was a U.S. blockade around Cuba that was going to stop Russian ships from coming. And Russia said, you can't do that. That is illegal. We have a right to go in. Who are you to tell us we can't put missiles in the base of our ally? And in fact, that's true. Who are you? So they're bringing the missiles. They're bringing the missiles in. Submarines were escorting them underneath the surface. The U.S. had set up a blockade and was starting to drop depth charges. Unbeknownst to us, and this captain told us for the first time in this conference, the submarines were armed with nuclear-tipped torpedoes. And they were under orders to fire under attack. They were being attacked. The depth charges were coming down. They had a meeting of the captain, the bosun, the second in command, and the political officer, because it had to be a consensus to use the missile, use the torpedo. They voted. It was 2-1. 2-1. One vote stopped them from using that nuclear torpedo and starting World War III. So we came much closer to nuclear annihilation than anybody realized at the time or for decades later. I, for one, am very glad to see this normalization of relations and to see the United States and Cuba once again, or maybe, depending on your point of view, for the first time in history, become genuine friends. Yeah. Thank you.
Every piece of history of this magnitude has a subtext. I, unlike many of you, have never been to Cuba. So I looked for the subtext, understanding the importance of today's coming out. And what I found was fascinating. Two things in the news caught my eye. In December, Raul Castro thanked Pope Francis for his help in normalizing or moving relations with the United States to a better place. And the other was a small piece in a Florida paper which said that the first Catholic church to be built in Cuba in 50 years would be started with $50,000 raised at a small Catholic church in Tampa. And those two things are quite, in my view, they piqued my curiosity to see what is the lineage. How connected are these things, and what exactly has happened as a sidebar to what Joe and Mauro have spoken about. So I have to take you back to 1998 when Pope John Paul II visits Cuba. And he doesn't visit alone. He invites an assistant bishop from South America named Francis to go with him. And from the meetings that they have, Francis writes and publishes the dialogues between Fidel and John Paul II. And therein begins an interest and a dedication to change on the part of the church with regard to Cuba. Now, inside Cuba, Francis has a good ally in the cardinal. The cardinal, whose name is Jaime Ortega, has been a friend, and what do I know? He is reported to be a friend of Raul Castro, and you say, well, why would that be particularly? And it doesn't make sense unless you remember that as young boys, both Fidel and Raul Castro were educated by the Jesuits. And so the thread of Catholicism runs through them, estranged for many years. When the revolution took place, the church lost its buildings, its land. It was a crime, of course, to practice your faith. And over the years, beginning with this, I'm sure there were perhaps inklings of this, but really 1998 is the marker for when there was a little bit of loosening of how people might practice their faith. And some of those institutions were returned. And the church was allowed after 1998 to build one seminary. And this interested me greatly, and I think it ties together well. The church was allowed to build a business school. Now, that didn't make sense to me then, but it does if you consider that the church had two missions. One was to open back up the practice of religion in Cuba, but the other was to alleviate poverty. And I think there has been a vision outside of Cuba, held for Cuba by Francis and Ortega inside, that there was a way to bring both faith and some prosperity back to Cuba jointly. And so in 2012, Pope Benedict comes back to Cuba. And it really, at this point, we get some acceleration. There's a lot more conversation, back channel. Those of you who have visited will have your own experiences about this, but it's my impression from reading that at this point, there are now schools, and there is the church is more visible. There is much more of a welcoming spirit. There's a much stronger relationship personally between Ortega and Raul Castro, and that at this point there becomes active diplomacy, and the church participates in facilitating this diplomacy back channel. So I offer this to say, in any big historic turns, there are many sidebars. This is one I would ask you to keep your eye on. I think it is that what we are about to see will involve a reclaiming of a truly beautiful and historic piece of Cuban culture, which relates to the Catholic Church. And I think that is not always, it cheers me in this way. It is both wonderful for Cuba, but it is wonderful to consider both the power of this church, but religions generally, to practice that moral progressivism that is often preached, but is not practiced at a sophisticated level of diplomacy. And it was here, and it appears to be working, which is, I think, magnificent. There are two other things I want you to keep your eye on as Cuba opens up. One is the internet, and Joe mentioned Netflix. Now, for us, it's hard to imagine. People stand in line for hours to get into an internet cafe. The cost of using it for 2 hours is $5, and that's a week's wages. Wow. And so it is extraordinary. If you are a small business operator and you own one of these original B&Bs, the way you make your reservations is you go on that internet twice a month and get your reservations and communicate with the outside world in tourism. And that's how you begin to operate in this world. So this is anathema to us. We are spoiled, we are overconnected, we are plagued by connectivity.
I'm making a reservation right now.
So when you take this fact, which is the closed nature, I work with a number of members of Congress, and when they travel to Cuba, and 2 delegations of women have traveled to visit with Cuban women and Cuban women leaders recently, they are offline for the time that they are there. So it's not just a story, it is what happens. So the interesting piece of this, though, is the marriage of the demand for the internet with a millennial generation in Cuba that is very different from its parent generation. So they have enough taste of what this is like, that they are very hungry. They're hungry to travel. 2/3 of them have said, of the millennials have said, and that's under 34, have said they would like to live in another country. That is a disaster for Cuba. So the modernization, their survival and ability to hold on to that millennial generation is directly related to their willingness to modernize rapidly, because it will become quickly easier to come and go, and they know that. So calibrating how modern they become before they open up completely is a very important thing to them. And we need to be mindful and sensitive that some things will go slowly, purposefully. Because this same millennial generation, about that same number, 60%, would love to open businesses in Cuba. They love Cuba. They want to stay home. But they won't stay home if they can't get that access and citizenry of the world that we take for granted. So watch the millennials, see who stays there. That's an important thing. And then thirdly, the universal language of sports. On April 23rd, the NBA will operate a clinic in Cuba for 3 days under the auspices of the International Sports whatever. And I was fascinated by this because
ISW for those of you.
Thank you, Bill. Sports, whatever. So for 3 days, our NBA is going to go down there and run a sports clinic. And this really fascinated me because I would have guessed baseball.
Yeah.
Right? So we all think baseball, but no, the NBA, and they did this under cloak of darkness, so much so that when it was announced the other day, the Miami Heat, who are the basketball team in Miami, were furious. Just furious, because they wanted in on this, right? There is so much hunger for those relationships, whether it's the church or the NBA in Florida, to have a hand in what's going to go on. But the other thing I will tell you is many of the best baseball players, as you know, from this part of the world play for a great deal of money here in the United States. And it's sort of sweet to me, and I'll end on this. The best baseball player, and I wrote his name down phonetically, so I hope you'll be able to tell if I can find it. His name is Yulesky Guerrero. No, it's Yulesky Gurriel. And he's 30 now, so they consider him beyond his prime. He plays for $50 a month, and he is the best player there. He did not leave. But again, this notion, I think we cannot underestimate the anxiety of people who truly are invested in the success of Cuba. Their concern that with so little to hold on to people, the notion of opening up means a potential brain drain. It means a talent scatter. And I think we have to be very sensitive to that as we want to hurry history. This piece of history for their success must go slowly.
Wow. I don't know much about Cuba.
Bill, you're on.
Pure poetry. My name's Bill Clifford. Exactly a year ago, I was in a synagogue in Havana where I was treated to the Malpaso Dance Company.
A member.
And they are phenomenal artists. During the week that I was there, and not here, sadly, I was exposed to incredible chorals, not the standard Buena Vista Social Club musicians, but I saw those two classical musicians, painters, authors, and this is where the intelligentsia goes. Smart people do not have business opportunities like we do here, or even, say, places like Thailand or Brazil. So they go into the arts where they can express themselves. And it reminded me of the press, the clampdown that Mauro mentioned. Our guide said, there's one thing, one truth in the daily newspaper Gramma, the date. There will be more truths revealed later. I want to start looking at a deeper history in U.S.-Cuban relations. In the 19th century, this country coveted Cuba. 1823, John Quincy Adams said, "If an apple severed by its native tree cannot choose but to fall to the ground, Cuba can gravitate only to North America." In 1898, of course, we intervened in the War of Independence. Cuba was fighting against Spain. We quickly defeated the Spanish, occupied the island for 3 years, and the price of Cuban independence was the notorious Platt Amendment, which allowed the United States the right to intervene forever to protect Cuban independence. And it also gave us the lease to naval stations, particularly Guantanamo. And so it was, more than a half a century later, the Bay of Pigs, we acted on that right to intervene and sent a CIA-backed brigade of Cuban exiles to the Bay of Pigs, and of course, Castro's forces beat them in 3 days. Che Guevara called this the greatest political bonanza. And ever since, with this embargo that we have against Cuba, Castro, Fidel, and Raul have used this to justify their policies. Fidel better than anybody else in very public speeches all the time. He could go to his nation and explain away the destitution that communism was wreaking on them by saying, this is the Yankees' fault, right? So we have sort of undermined our own interest there. I've read 2 books on Cuba only. One is a tremendous history. It's called Cuba, A New History by Richard Gott. It's not so new, but it's 2005. But it covers the history more from Cuban perspective. This book here, I encourage everyone to read. This is Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana by Peter Kornblue, who's an archivist, and William Leo Grande, who's a professor at American University. This book, chapter by chapter, the chapters are the names of 11 presidents. And it is extraordinary in this relationship of hostility, which gets all the news, how much work there has been in every administration. And often, more often than not, it's Havana extending the olive branch to get a dialogue going. And so one lesson is, despite all the adversity, there are always reasons. We discussed this yesterday on the Iran panel. There are always reasons and opportunities for dialogue. And even JFK himself, having botched Bay of Pigs after the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the embargo being instituted, there were approaches, and at that time, thank you very much, the message deliverer was a French journalist. There were American journalists, all manner of people were used to drop messages because everything had to be top secret. The political environment was so severe against dealing with Reds. And so there was really an effort, even towards the end of, or middle of JFK's term, to have a rapprochement with Castro. And of course, he was assassinated. And Fidel says, they're going to blame it on us. And of course, there were conspiracy theories to that effect. Kissinger, fresh from the success of the opening to China, thought that they could do the exact same modus vivendi with Castro. And so they began to actively use back channels. It's interesting that Nixon hated Fidel, loathed him from that 1959 meeting. Kissinger said, we've got to be big here. We've got to be big, let's deal. And then Angola happened. And Cuba sent troops, and that was it for Kissinger. Nevertheless, in 1975, in the tiniest of gestures, Kissinger signed off on having the OAS drop certain sanctions on Cuba. And the lesson that emerges from this is that Cuba did not perceive it as a gesture. They just said, Washington has no choice. These sanctions are destroying their image within Latin American countries. They have to do it. So there was always this olive branch extended, or a gesture here or there, or a concession maybe on one side or the other, but it was the misperception of what that meant that set things back, right? Our politics always got in the way, as it is now, with Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez, Jeb Bush, all on the right, are critical of this thaw, which is so gentle. I would call this the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. This is the end of 50 years of beginning trying to deal nation to nation. And Cuba, for the reasons I mentioned in the 3 points of history through over 150 years, Cuba wants to be treated as an equal. So even when it responded to US concerns, it wanted to make sure that whatever it was offering was seen as a Cuban initiative rather than a concession. High level of pride here, right? And so what is happening today is, as Joe mentioned, is more history could be made. I want to just read a quick point to show the, who starts and who finishes here. Raul Castro was speaking to a U.S. congressional delegation led by Senator Patrick Leahy in February 2013. We both made mistakes, but it's time to put the past behind us. 11 months later, in December, at that funeral for Nelson Mandela, Mr. President, I am Castro, Raul said as he extended his hand. I know, Barack Obama replied. They then had, last December, a 45-minute call. Why did that call take place? Well, I think there are so many facilitating factors. You mentioned Pope Francis, the Canadians, in this case, not a journalist handing a letter, but the Canadians, our friends to the north, have been offering their offices for secret meetings for about 18 months. This coincides, and I think it is mostly coincidental, but it's an important coincidence, coincides with Hugo Chávez's death. And Chávez was a big voice for a certain kind of political populism, and I think that is sort of a lubrication, but more to the point, the oil subsidies that Venezuela has been able to provide to Cuba have been vastly diminished, and it's really a squeeze. So Raul Castro has had reason to think about coming to the table. And on the US side, I think there is, I think we can take President Obama at face value. We're almost exactly the same age. For our entire lives, we've been living with this embargo, and it hasn't worked. The purpose of it was to get rid of the Castro brothers. I mean, hello? Buenos dias. Why can we have diplomatic relations reestablished with communist China? Why can we do it with Vietnam? Why can't we do it with Cuba? We didn't want them in the Soviets' orbit, and they are 90 miles away from Key West. We didn't want them fomenting leftist, terrorist activities in Latin America, right? But come the fall of the wall, there is no Soviet Union. There is no ability really for Cuba to stick its neck out because it doesn't have the cash to really do much in Latin America. It's lost that much influence. So what the embargo remained, the only reason, it seems to me, is regime change. And it hasn't really screwed up the Cubans. It may have in the 60s when those sanctions were biting, and they've been, some of them have been lifted over the years, but Castro's regime has hurt the Cubans now, right? Not these sanctions anymore. So what has happened is we're moving very slowly, steadily to diplomatic relations. Joe mentioned this. Why can't we have embassies in each country? Well, for the Cubans to have an embassy in Washington, they need a bank. Comes down to that. You can't have a bank if you're a state sponsor of terror. Our banks will not do anything with you. So, and this is just one example of who's going to go first. We establish the mission. So I hope this comes out of the Summit of Americas. This is really almost an expectation.
Yeah.
So this is, look for that. The travel, I went on an OFAC license from the Treasury Department. Had to be an educational group. We couldn't go anywhere but to our program. A buddy of mine actually and I took one of those classic cars for a 15-minute ride to the beach, which is exactly as Joe described, and spent there 15 minutes walking up and down in pristine nothingness, and then back to our hotel in Havana. And I just thought, if this place opens up, it's going to be spring break on steroids. I mean,
It's a beautiful country.
it's
Beautiful country.
so lush.
Maybe we should go to questions?
I'm ready. I'm going to finish right now. The other business lifting of restrictions means that people can spend more money. Americans can use credit cards rather than the cooks. Remittances have increased for Cubans, $500 to $2,000 per quarter. This is actually, when you're talking about $5 being the weekly rate, this is a lot of money that's going in there, and they're also taking these tubular bags that contain auto parts and everything you can load up with Costco. They are very entrepreneurial. I mean, geez, even those buildings, and God forbid we lose 3 or 4 a day, because of the expense of living, within floors, they have built mid-level ceilings so that I could never walk there, but you crouch and you double the people in a given box. You adapt. And there must be a lot of money stashed in mattresses there, just waiting to be spent on businesses. I'll end there. What a beautiful country it is.
Yeah. Thank you very much for very enlightening and differing opinions of Cuba. I've been there, but I wasn't aware of much of what you've told me. Now, would you like to interact between each other?
I think I want to hear from the
Let's
people
interact
going
with you.
there.
All these people going.
They could all be up here, right?
Come on, all you students stand up. Where are you?
It's 9 o'clock, man.
Yeah, exactly.
On Friday. Yeah.
This gentleman over here to the left.
Hi, good morning. Thanks to all of you for coming and for this wonderful presentation. How likely do you think it is, if there is to be a big economic opening up in Cuba, that the government there will make it possible for the benefits to flow to the Cuban people rather than Sheldon Adelson opening a casino and the cruise lines ruining all the bays and the Marriott hotels taking over accommodations and the Cuban people ending up flipping burgers and making beds.
That's a really good question. Who wants to go
Who
there?
was-
I think that's a very real risk. I think there's a real risk that some of the beautiful coral reefs that I saw while I was there will be destroyed in order to make room for cruise ships. I think there's no question that American hotel chains want to come in and do business there and start packaging tours, which will have very little to do with the Cuban people. That is a very real risk. I forget which one of you said that. I think it was you that said for the sake of the Cuban people, we need this change to go slowly.
Yes.
And I think that's
Right.
that's absolutely true.
There's a saying there. It's actually what Raul Castro says, is that we will move forward without haste, without delay. Oh, shit, what is this?
Without delay,
Without haste, but without delay.
Oh,
That's
okay,
what he
good,
says.
good. Yeah, right.
Ah, I hate it when that happens. And I think what's really aware, the Cuban people are very aware of this. When we were there, they were talking about this. They don't want to be flattened again. I mean, that's really, they don't want us to be under the elephant. So
And remember, there is other international investment there. I mean, I stayed in a resort that was a Jamaican resort.
Right.
The Canadians, the Europeans don't have this embargo. They've invested. But the American style of investment is decisively different.
yes, yeah. But there is also there's a sort of automatic restraint in that they don't have that much food, energy. There are going to be sort of breaks on how fast you can throw up hotels, and with business in general, investors have to deal with the government.
Yeah.
Importers can't just sell to a buyer. You have to go to a Cuban state holding company. You can't have more than 50% stake in an investment you make. So there are breaking opportunities. And while Raul is, I think he's late 80s. I mean, he's not long for it. That's going to be another thing is what will the political system look like?
One thing that occurs to me is it would be interesting to imagine what it would look like if we exported what we learned and not just what we sell. So we know better than to use fossil fuels. So if we exported renewable energy intelligence, that might help. If we think about how this is in many ways an economic clean slate, how would we help them? And I think that this is, I want to have a lot of faith in our State Department in terms of the negotiations and what goes first and second and third. And I hope that what you described doesn't go first.
By the way, there have been talks already on the possibilities of oil spills in the water because of after the BP fiasco. So that kind of conversation does go on. But I would agree, I wish that all the cultural preservationists in our country would get together with a delegation and go there, because the beautiful buildings in Havana that, it's dust crumbling, they certainly don't have the money to repair them, but to demolish them would be just a sin.
right, and just a note on the Gulf spill, the Cuban waters are actually the hatcheries now for the fish that are populating the Gulf.
I wanted to ask a question along the lines of how much environmental awareness can they afford, or are they proposing to use as they move forward?
Well, they've been forced into an incredibly pristine environment. I mean, when the Russians pulled out, petrochemicals went with them, and they've got the best organic food
Yes.
of anyone, and they could be exporting that. I mean, I think that they're not as, I didn't detect, I don't know if you all have a different perspective, but I didn't I didn't, with the people that we were set up to talk to, because we were also there on an educational tour, and so it was everybody was kind of programmed. There was not kind of that big awareness, except about their waters, that their waters were very clean, but not as big an environmental awareness.
All right, this gentleman over here.
I want everybody to know about a beautiful book of photography of Cuba by a Magnum photographer, David Allen Harvey. It's called Cuba Island at the Crossroads. And if you can't remember all that, just look for Magnum Cuba book. And my question is about the political impetus against opening Cuba in America. I have this impression, without knowing that much about things, that so much of the political oomph, especially in Florida, is about people who are upset about the confiscation of property in the revolution. That really is the center thing behind the whole business. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, or what else?
Let me start, and others may have. For decades, relations with Cuba were the third rail in Florida politics. I mean, you just did not touch this. And largely it was because of the very strong presence of the expats, the Cuban Americans, who were both a very large voting bloc and a very large donor base for politicians in both parties in Florida. Several things have happened. Those people got old. And the new generation, so the children, don't have that same attitude, that same financial relationship, because you're right. A lot of them fled and their properties were confiscated. And they've always wanted to go back and reclaim their properties and overthrow the Castro, obviously. So the new generation of Cuban Americans in Florida don't have that same. My niece dates a Cuban American. He's delighted by this change, wants it to happen, wants to be able to go back and forth and see his cousins in Cuba. He doesn't want to go there. So that's a big thing. I actually look at this as kind of a harbinger on what's happening with Iran, which you've all heard me talk about ad nauseum, because this was something you just did not do, and then we did it, and it wasn't that big a deal. I mean, there's overwhelming support for this. You heard, I mean, these certain politicians take these rote positions and condemn it, but they actually don't do much about it. It's a statement. They're not actually working on it. And if we can, if this goes as well as it seems to be going and has this much kind of popular support, I think this bodes well for the next historic relationship change in the queue, which is U.S.-Iran relations.
And U.S. Latin American relations.
Oh, right.
I mean, this is all about that too. Obama is going to have, with immigration and U.S. Western Hemisphere relations, the GOP is in a corner here. And you can talk about, I think it wasn't just about business, it was about human rights. And there was some thread to coddling dictators. I mean, it was the Cold War. And when you're that close to nuclear annihilation, this is sensitive stuff. But no, the polls are all showing that Americans favor the end of the embargo. And it's in Congress's hands, not Obama's.
Very good. This gentleman over here.
I was wondering if that old guard that still, I think, is very influential in Florida will be also influential in persuading a Republican president who may well be elected next year into rolling this back. That bunch, which the late Molly Ivins referred to as the Branch Floridians, I think may still have some very strong influence.
Well, a former governor is running, so yes, I think there will be influence, but I just don't, I think the writing's on the wall.
It doesn't seem as powerful as it used to be. It's there, yes. I mean, obviously it influences the statements, but determining the politics of it, stopping the change, it's just much, I think it's too weak to have much of an impact at this point.
And actually, I think there's a counterforce at work. I think what works for Marco Rubio in Florida will undercut any chance he thinks he has of being president of the United States. The rest of the country is very clear on this, and if nothing else, that will cause a change in tactic, if not true view.
All right, this gentleman.
Joe, you might best be able to respond to this. I have a question regarding the criteria to get on to the very short list that we maintain on state-sponsored terrorism. Over the course of this last week, we have discussed drone strikes across multiple borders. I think we've heard in session after session that we have special forces poised or operating in 100 countries around the world. We have a very recent history of extraordinary renditions from multiple countries. We still have Guantanamo Bay, where people are held for more than a decade without charges. I'm kind of wondering, do we belong on our own terrorist watch list?
Touche.
The United States of South Sudan.
Well, where you stand on this question, I think, depends on where you sit. And there's no question that for many people around the world, we are a state terrorist organization. That is how they see us. And this is like, maybe you heard this. This is why my friend Dennis Blair, former Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Command and later Director of National Intelligence, surprised me a few years ago when at a conference 3 years ago now, he came out against continuing drone strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan. He said they were creating far more terrorists than they were destroying. And when I heard him say this, I mean, he is like fourth generation Naval Academy. I changed my mind about it because I'd been attracted to this technique, actually. It's so precise, seemingly precise. And so there's no, and this is what he's saying on the ground level. The Afghans, the Pakistans, the Yemenis, the Somalis, they saw us as terror from the sky. So do we belong on the list? I don't know, but some of our practices certainly are terrorizing good, decent, innocent people around the world.
Any other comment?
I would say what's going on in Guantanamo is, you could make the case that that's terror. There are scores of prisoners who are deemed to be dangerous but are not even charged.
Before everybody leaves, I have an important announcement about a panel. It's not in your book, called Conference Interruptus. It'll be in Mackey Auditorium at 4 this afternoon, and the participants are to be disclosed later, but it's a public discussion of the CWA going forward. That will be of interest to a lot of you. That's 4 o'clock this afternoon in Mackey.
Hi, my name is Carlos Ortega. I'm born in Cuba. I don't say enough question for you guys. I say thank you so much for the big opening for my country, because I live in Cuba for 41 years, and for everyone it's so difficult. I think this is the big opportunity we have there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We had time for a couple of questions.
Oh, good. Very quickly to Mary, and then I have a question for Mr. Clifford. Do you want to go to Cuba on Sunday?
Wow. I do. Can you ask that of me?
Mr. Clifford, yes, that is my question of you. You mentioned an increase in remittances, and I'm afraid I don't know from whom to whom for what. So if you could elaborate on that, I would appreciate it very much.
I think the gentleman who just asked a question could explain it better than I can. But money here from Cuban American families, which is being sent back to their relatives or friends, they are allowed a certain minimum. I think currently it's $500 a quarter, but it's going up.
Actually, it went from 2,000 to 8,000 with Obama's announcement in December.
Oh, thank you.
No, not for a year. 2,000 a year to 8,000 a year.
Yes, so
it
2,000 a
went-
quarter,
was-
same number,
so
same
it's-
number.
Yeah, same number, 2,000, but that was changed in December to 8,000.
I'll ask this gentleman here, who I know has been to Cuba 14 times.
Thank you, Paul. The panel has done a stunning job. I salute you. It was very, very great. My question comes from Cuba. I'm involved with the Boulder Cuban Sister City program. We go to Cuba. I asked our guide, a 30-year-old woman with 2 daughters, is there any question you'd like to ask me about America? And this was on the last day of our trip in January of this year. She said to me, Spence, will you Americans still love us after the embargo is lifted? I thought that was a very poignant question. I'd like to offer it to the panel.
It's interesting, this succession that's going to take place eventually. Some analysts think that it might end up being a Putin-style crony state oligarchy. Others think, do they have the technocratic base to be like a China? Will it be Kim in North Korea? Interestingly, Raul has a daughter who's a legislator, and she is ardent in supporting the socialist revolution, but she also has one claim to fame, which is being the only one in the 612-member assembly to have voted no. And she voted no because she felt that a workers' rights bill did not go far enough in relieving discrimination against people with HIV or alternative gender identities. So she's pro-LGBT. Will she be a leader? A president? Who knows? But there is family. There's the potential for dynasty. That's going to be the question you ask. What is the shape of the Cuban government? It's theirs to, we hope, choose fairly.
Let me offer a slightly different way into answering your question, which is that for many Americans in the boomer generation, Cuba is a romantic place. I know what I know about what Joe said about the flamingo from The Godfather.
Everything you need to know is in the Godfather films.
Yeah, that's true about politics for sure. But I think there is literature, there are movies that have informed us because nothing else could inform us. There wasn't news, there wasn't real life to know. And so what we know has a romantic patina that I think withstands the lifting of the embargo, and in fact creates a curiosity. The fact that so many of you have been, when ostensibly it is closed, suggests to me that is perhaps the least of their worries.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we had
this
time
guy's
for one.
a real Latin American
Yeah,
expert.
one
A
more
real one.
question.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Terry Vogt. First, a shameless plug for the next panel here, which will be Tales from the Peace Corps. And we hope that it won't be too many years from now that we can get Cuba as one of the 60-odd countries in which the Peace Corps will be serving. I do have a very short comment because Mary's comment about the baseball player reminded me of how I've been getting my news for the last 5 years from Cuba. And that is a great website that updates only about once a month by Joanne Sanchez. Her name begins with Y. The name of her website is Los de Y, which means those whose names begin with Y. Now, this is really important to understand history in Cuba because something like, I'm going to guess, 80% of the children born during the rapprochement with the Soviets after Yuri Gagarin have their names beginning with Y. Most of the Cuban baseball players' names begin with Y. Now, question. Hickenlooper, a good Colorado name. That is the name of the amendment in Congress, which restricts a lot of the abilities of people to do business with Cuba. In particular, it was having to do with Citibank's assets that they had to leave in Cuba. There are two things that I'd like the panelists to comment very shortly on. One is, do you think there will be any move to do some form, absent, as I say, absent a regime change, any devolution of assets or negotiation on that? And secondly, at what point might there be some truth and reconciliation?
That's a huge subject, and we have about 1 minute to address it. So I think you'll have to go talk to the panelists afterwards. We give you a minute to.
Let me just say, that, although there's a great euphoria now and optimism and enthusiasm for what's happening, there are going to be bumps in the road. There always are. I mean, we have differences with Canada, so you're going to hear things, and you might hear speeches from the Cuban leaders. When somebody asked me to comment on Ayatollah Khamenei's speech yesterday, which made some news, which was very critical of the recent Iran deal reached and seemed to be saying some very negative things about the United States. I believe he's saying that for his own domestic political purposes, to shore up his base, ensure his base that he's still the tough guy leader and he's not going to be suckered by America. I expect you will hear things like that from the Cubans, to speak to their base, to reassure their base. There is politics in Cuba, there are factions in Cuba, so be prepared for a few bumps in the road, but overall, I think the trends are crystal clear. I think the desire of the two governments and the two peoples are too strong to be derailed at this point.
I must say, I just made a mistake. We had more time left than I thought. So we will.
Well, in that case.
So go ahead.
I think he said it.
I didn't quite, Terry, catch the financial assets part of the question. Is that referring to the $7 billion that had been expropriated? Over. I can't answer you.
Yeah, they're not going to do anything about that.
Sorry.
All right. This lady over here.
Hi, I have had the wonderful opportunity of visiting Cuba once, and I'd like to go again, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on when we might be free to go without a tour, and also what might be the ramifications of just going and taking our chances with the State Department.
Let me just say, well, on the first part, why don't you stay there for a second? It's happening quickly. American Airlines really, really, really wants to start flights to Havana. You can go to Miami Airport now, and you can see departures Havana up there. And that wasn't true a month ago, and it's true now.
Yeah. I mean, individuals had been going, north to Canada or through Mexico or something. There are charter flights direct from New York and New Orleans now. The thing about American Airlines, I read, is that it's sort of hinging a little bit on the expropriated assets, that there's some chance that a plane lands and it's kept, so.
I actually think before the end of the year you might see this change. Already, you can fairly easily qualify for the guidelines that would justify an individual's visit, but it does require some paperwork. It's not just buying a ticket.
My question, it's a bit of a question comment, is that you mentioned that it would be nice to share our knowledge of sustainable energy and other scientific realities, and I think that it's really important to keep in mind that Cuba, their scientists are incredible. And I suppose my question to you is, I was curious whether there has been summits or opportunities for Cuban scientists to actually come here and share what they have had to learn over these many, many years of having to live with so little. And has there been an openness for the scientists to come and share what they know? Do you know of an event?
There's long been permitted scientific and educational exchanges and cultural exchanges. I don't have any particular knowledge of where or who was involved in those scientific exchanges.
But I think also that has happened in third countries. Not so
Other
much
countries.
coming to the United States,
Right.
but other countries.
Well, I do hope it happens because we have a lot to learn too from what they know. Thank you very much. It's great.
This lady over here?
Yes, following up on what this last woman who's standing here said, I too would like to go to Cuba to visit, and I am wondering, after it's open and I can go freely, how long might I have before the culture has become so homogenized that it's no different than any other country? I'm thinking of, say, Germany, after reuniting with West Germany. East Germany became pretty homogenous too after. How long do I really have to see what it's like more or less now?
6 months? Oh, I don't know. That's a difficult question to answer, but unlike some spots in the Caribbean, Cuba's a large country with a very long history, very proud, and its isolation has in some ways strengthened that. I would think that it's going to be very resistant to that kind of homogenation. So I think you'll have some time. It's a hard question to predict. Anybody else have thoughts?
I've been to many Asian countries over time, and the thing that I notice most are the super highways that have come around, Chiang Mai, Thailand, or in China, just ring road after ring road being added on. The culture holds, I do think, by and large, despite the growth and sometimes the ugly growth. But the contrast. I mentioned this the other day between Teslas on sidewalks for sale in Beijing, and then you go to the food stalls and there are scorpions dancing on the sticks. I mean, they're within less than 100 yards. So, and I think again, I started with the cultural. There is such a pride for their arts. By the way, the art market is going to just explode.
Oh yeah.
It's going to go nuts. No, I think responsible tourism. You make a difference too.
Yeah. Okay, one last question.
Thank you very much, panelists. I have the pleasure of going to Cuba this past January, right before the, our permit was issued right before the announcement. But I want to talk about the people of Cuba really, really briefly in a quick comment, because I know we don't have much time. But I met the
You have a question?
Yes, the ear, nose, and throat specialist, leading ear, nose, throat specialist in Canada. You know how much she makes in Cuba. The leading ear, nose, and throat specialist on the island. $30 a month, right?
Yeah.
Roughly, yeah. So she takes 3 weeks vacation a year in Toronto and does elder care there and makes several orders of magnitude more than her salary in that time. So what does that mean for this whole brain drain problem in Cuba?
Tough question.
None of us are qualified to answer that question, but it goes back to do this slowly. You can bet the government's aware of this. That's part of the reasons there'll be restrictions, that'll be a tension in the relationship, because some people are going to want these restrictions to be lifted quite rapidly. Others are going to be worried about this, what'd you call talent scattering? Yeah, so it's a very, very real problem. And so the government's going to be struggling to try to find ways to increase the incomes of the people to keep them to stay, but it can't increase them so much that it imbalances the whole rest of the economy. I mean, if you're trying to do a command economy, this is going to be a really tough job.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.